Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Kristen Smith. Joining me today is the Center Square's Pennsylvania reporter, Christina Lingell. Christina, how are you doing?
Good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well. Today we're going to talk about the whole pie of mass incarceration in America, which apparently costs $182 billion. And it seems like everyone thinks that that's a lot of money, but not everyone thinks it's a problem that we spend that much to keep people locked behind bars. So what camp does Pennsylvania fall into?
I would say that Pennsylvania, unsurprisingly, falls kind of in the middle. There's definitely an appetite for the more law and order, sort of tough on crime policies that have created our current incarceration situation. But there's also a lot of areas where reform has taken priority. And that's been especially true, like in Philadelphia. The district attorney, Krasner, there has made a lot of very progressive moves in terms of their criminal justice system. And there's definitely a big push for reform, even within the legislature, particularly areas like juvenile justice and improving the circumstances in the Department of Corrections overall have been priorities, I would say, on both sides of the aisle.
That being said, the prison population in Pennsylvania is still going up, right?
Yes. So across the country, there was a huge drop in the prison population during COVID-19, during the initial stages of the pandemic. And this was twofold. Partially, people were doing less because everyone was inside. And additionally, to slow and stop the spread, it was, important to really try to limit the amount of people who are all crowded together into small spaces like that. So we actually did see prisons being sort of hotbeds for outbreaks of the virus, where even just surrounding towns around prisons became really impacted when there were outbreaks. So there are both practical reasons for that and political reasons for that. But ultimately, a lot of states have started to slowly allow their population to creep back up since then. So for the most part, there are about 10 states who have actually continued that downward trend, whereas the vast majority have gone slowly up. And then there are about, I think, around 10 states that have really, really pushed their numbers back up. I think Texas, for instance, accounted for on its own over 30% of the prison population growth in the entire country in the past, from 2021 to 2023.
How do we compare globally, since your reporting seems to get into that too, about where America is in contrast to the rest of the world and how they incarcerate people?
So Pennsylvania is pretty on par with the overall incarceration rate in America. When you look at our neighbors like New Jersey, you'll see a lower rate than Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is more like the actual country. When you'll see different numbers for the whole country, ranging from 540 per 100,000 people to over 600 per 100,000 people. In either case, it still puts us well above any democracy, and fifth globally for any type of country, any type of government. So we have a very high prison population in this country. In fact, the population itself is the highest in the world, but the rate is below about 4 other countries.
And advocates say that one of the ways that we could actually save money is bail reform, right?
Yeah, so this is a pretty interesting one because Philadelphia has done some experimentation with this, where they are not asking for bail in lower level crimes. Of course, if someone's charged with murder or something like that, they're going to need bail, or they'll be held without bail if there was a violent crime and they pose a danger to society. But for lower level crimes like drug possession, retail theft, stuff like that, people aren't being held for bail. And they found that the same they're coming back in the same rates for court, because regardless of whether or not you have bail, you will get in trouble if you don't show up for a court date, right? So most people do return, and it seems that like bail's not the effective collateral that we maybe think it is. On the other hand, when people can't pay bail and they are stuck in prison, that does cost the taxpayer quite a bit of money. It can cost, on the low end, $40,000 a year to keep someone incarcerated. On the high end, it's closer to 60 to 70,000. So that's a lot of money to keep someone because they can't afford to pay bail to get out. And that's actually something that impacts sentencing and can be a pretty negative factor for a lot of people, because a lot of people will just plead guilty to something even if they didn't do it, because that lets them get out of jail, and they just don't have the money to pay their way out of jail and wait for that trial. So bail reform could be a big game changer. And in Pennsylvania, it's especially difficult for people who are in low income circumstances, people coming from poverty, because our bails range from like $5,000 to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And usually those hundreds of thousands of dollars are for very high crimes, but the average is still around $20,000. So if you're paying a bail bondsman 10% to even just post bail, 10% of $20,000, I mean, people don't really just have that lying around for the most part.
Well, Christina, thanks for joining us today. If you want to keep up with this story and more, visit thecentersquare.com.